In the sunny suburban sprawl of whispering cedars, every house looked pristine, nearly identical in design except for subtle variations in paint hue. Perfectly trimmed shrubs, neatly maintained sidewalks, and matching mailboxes offered a postcard image of American suburban life. At a glance, it was the very image of neighborly calm. This quiet facade, however, was carefully watched over by the local homeowners association, the Whispering Cedars HOA, whose stringent rules on lawn care, trash placement, and exterior decorations governed everyone's day-to-day. The HOA board consisted of a handful of neighbors, some well-intentioned, some overzealous. And then there was Janet Harnell, though many privately referred to her as Karen. Janet was in her mid-50s, with short, meticulously styled hair and a preference for crisp, professional outfits. She had served on the HOA board for 3 years, earning a reputation for her aggressive approach to enforcing trivial regulations. From mailbox color to garden gnome placement, she had an uncanny ability to spot the smallest infraction from half a block away. One summer, change arrived in the form of Diana Salazar, a warm-hearted woman in her 30s who had recently moved into Unit 3G of the Maplewood Complex, a set of multi-level condos within Whispering Cedars. The Maplewood Complex was known for its well-kept balconies, communal hallways, and a modest courtyard. Diana used a wheelchair due to a spinal cord injury she'd sustained several years prior. She'd chosen Maplewood Complex because of its promise of accessible ramps, wide hallways, and an inclusive HOA, as stated in the promotional materials. With bright optimism, she hoped to live comfortably and meet good neighbors in this suburban haven. On Diana's first morning in her condo, sunshine streamed through broad windows, lighting up the polished floor. She arranged her living space with care, a cozy reading nook by the window, an open pathway for maneuvering her wheelchair, a small decorative table near the entryway. That same day, she wheeled out to the communal hall to check the notice board. The hallway was wide enough, just as advertised. She paused at a pinned flyer welcoming new residents, instructing them to contact the HOA for an orientation. A pleasant older woman across the hall stepped out at that moment, introduced herself as Margaret, a retired schoolteacher, and offered a friendly wave. "Let me know if you need anything," Margaret said, smiling. Diana smiled back, grateful for the warm greeting. A few doors down, however, a different pair of eyes watched, Janet Karen Harnell. Seeing Diana's wheelchair in the corridor, Janet frowned. Another special exception in the building, she thought. The Maplewood Complex was intended to be accessible, but in Janet's view, any additional accommodations might threaten the uniform appearance and orderliness she prized. Janet had observed how the wheelchair's occupant paused to read the board, briefly blocking part of the hallway. She let out an audible huff. Should people really be loitering there? She wondered. What if others need to pass? She made a mental note to keep watch on the new occupant in 3G and ensure that any special equipment wouldn't disrupt the corridor's look. That afternoon, Diana visited the HOA office to officially register. There, she encountered George Liu, the HOA president, a jovial man in his 40s who seemed genuinely happy to have new folks in the community. George shook her hand, ensuring she had no trouble navigating. He introduced her to the building's guidelines, quiet hours, pet regulations, and the standard aesthetic rules. Diana asked about specific accessibility notes, like if it was okay to keep her wheelchair in the hallway momentarily while she brought groceries inside. George shrugged good-naturedly. "As long as it's not permanently blocking anyone, I see no issue. The hallway is wide enough, and short moments shouldn't be a problem. Everyone does that from time to time, like parking a baby stroller or a suitcase in the corridor for a minute. We just ask that nothing be stored there long-term." Relieved, Diana returned to her condo with a spark of optimism. She had official approval. But across the neighborhood, Janet Harnell harbored doubts. She'd used her board position to push for stricter hallway rules in the past. She believed the Maplewood Complex overly indulged in making exceptions. "We can't let the place turn into a messy free-for-all," she told herself. "And this wheelchair, let's see if it stays out of the way." She made a vow. If it did not, she'd intervene. Thus, from day one, Diana's presence had unknowingly put her on Janet's radar. A single corridor conversation might have resolved any misunderstandings. Instead, a silent tension formed, one that would soon erupt into a shocking act of vandalism. fracturing the neighborhood's peaceful veneer. In the following weeks, Diana settled into Maplewood Complex with minimal fuss. She appreciated how most neighbors treated her kindly, offering a friendly wave in the hallway or a nod in the courtyard. An older gentleman named Rupert occasionally chatted with her about local gardening clubs. A middle-aged mother, Elena, sometimes asked if her kids' noises were too loud. Overall, Diana felt she was forging a new home among decent people. Every so often, she'd briefly park her wheelchair in the corridor while unlocking her door or juggling groceries. She was careful not to block the hall entirely. She always left ample space for others to pass. The building's layout had wide corridors, so this seemed harmless enough. Yet, unbeknownst to Diana, her routine had caught the eye of Karen Harnell. One Tuesday, as Diana carefully maneuvered a few grocery bags from the trunk of her car to the elevator, Janet happened to be in the lobby. She watched as Diana wheeled into the elevator, groceries perched on her lap. Janet pursed her lips. Was she hogging the elevator too long? Once upstairs, Diana wheeled into the hall, paused near her front door, and reached for keys. The corridor was quiet. She needed a moment to balance the bags and retrieve the door key from her purse. After maybe 30 seconds, she managed to unlock the door and roll inside. Only after she disappeared did Janet emerge from around the corner. A scowl marred her face. "Groceries left in the hall for half a minute," she muttered. Though, in truth, the wheelchair had been there with Diana the whole time, not just groceries abandoned. Still, Janet thought, this could be the start of hallway obstructions. Someone must keep watch. Janet typed notes on her phone. Referencing times and dates, she observed the wheelchair in common space. She snapped a quick photo of the corridor, though at that moment it was actually empty. Diana had already gone inside. Janet pinned the blame on the potential risk of blocked hallways, ignoring the fact that no real issue had occurred. A few days later, Diana found a typed note slipped under her door. It read, "Notice, it has been observed that personal belongings, including mobility equipment, are left in the common corridor for extended periods. This is a violation of Whispering Cedar's HOA guidelines regarding obstruction of communal areas. Please ensure that all items, including wheelchairs, remain inside your unit at all times unless actively entering or exiting the building." Diana's brow furrowed. She'd never left her wheelchair alone in the hallway for extended periods. She'd only paused momentarily while opening her door, something George Liu had told her was permissible. The letter didn't list any contact person, but it bore the HOA letterhead and a scrawled signature, J. Harnell. Sighing, Diana decided to clarify the matter with George. She composed a polite email explaining that she only placed her wheelchair in the hall for a minute when maneuvering groceries or unlocking her door, never blocking the entire hallway, and that George had said brief usage was fine. She attached pictures of how wide the corridor was, showing there was still ample space. Then she pressed send, hoping it would smooth over any confusion. Within a day, George replied, apologizing for the inconvenience. He stated that there must be a misunderstanding and that the official policy indeed allowed short stops. He promised to speak with the board to clear it up. Relieved, Diana thought the matter resolved. Yet, behind closed doors, Janet seethed at George's gentle approach. She believed the Maplewood complex was slipping into chaos with baby strollers, groceries, and now a wheelchair clogging the space. Determined to enforce her interpretation of the rules, she began intensifying her watch. She told herself it was for safety and aesthetics, even though no one else seemed concerned. The tension simmered, mostly invisible to Diana. She believed everything was fine after George's reassurance. But in Janet's mind, each day that she glimpsed Diana's wheelchair near the door, even for a moment, fueled her frustration. If the board won't act, maybe I must take matters into my own hands. As August drifted in, heat waves shimmered over Whispering Cedar's asphalt roads. The air conditioners hummed relentlessly, and many residents stayed indoors, emerging only in early mornings or late evenings to jog or walk pets. The Maplewood complex's corridors remained comfortably cool, courtesy of central air. Diana appreciated how easily her wheelchair glided over the smooth, climate-controlled floors. One evening, after a lengthy day at her office job, Diana returned home around 7 p.m. She was tired, a bit sweaty from the summer heat, and eager to relax. Balancing her tote bag on her lap, she rolled into the elevator. Upon reaching her floor, she turned into the hall. As usual, she paused for a few seconds to fish out her keys, the wheelchair angled slightly so she could open her door. At that precise moment, Karen, Parnell emerged from the elevator behind her. Diana heard footsteps too late to move aside. Janet came upon her from behind, brow furrowed. "Excuse me, you're blocking the corridor," Janet snapped. Startled, Diana turned her wheelchair to create more room. Indeed, the hall was wide enough, so there was no real blockade. She forced a polite smile. "I'm sorry, I'm just unlocking my door. There's space to pass, right?" Janet pursed her lips. "We have rules about storing personal items in common spaces, wheelchairs included. This is becoming a frequent occurrence." "I'm not storing it," Diana said patiently. "I'm just opening the door. It takes me a minute sometimes." She tried to keep her voice level. Janet waved a dismissive hand. "A minute, 5 minutes, it sets a precedent. Next, people might leave strollers or bicycles. Soon the hallway looks like a storage unit." Her tone dripped with exaggeration. A flicker of annoyance crossed Diana's face. She took a deep breath. "I understand the concern, but George, the HOA president, said short stops are allowed. If you'd like, we can talk to him together." Janet's jaw tightened. She muttered, "I'll do what I must to ensure the bylaws are upheld." With that, she marched off, high heels clicking on the polished floor, heading toward her own unit. The tension in the corridor lingered. Diana sighed, shaking her head as she finally slipped through her door. Inside, she let out the breath she'd been holding. She prayed that was the end of it. But that brief confrontation left a chill in the air. She could sense Janet's hostility now, unmistakable, pointed, and personal. A few nights later, as Diana prepared dinner, she scrolled through her phone to distract herself from the run-in. She saw a message on the neighborhood forum from a neighbor named Simone. "Heard about an incident with someone's wheelchair in the hallway. If that was you, I just want you to know that not everyone here is like that. Most of us don't mind short hallway stops. Feel free to reach out if you need any help." Touched by the kindness, Diana responded with thanks. She realized that while Janet might be loud, other neighbors were quietly supportive. This gave her hope that the matter would blow over. However, Janet's crusade was only intensifying. Privately, Janet complained to fellow board members about constant wheelchair sightings in the corridor. She drafted emails referencing Clause 7.2 of the HOA bylaws about maintaining unobstructed passages, though the bylaw primarily targeted furniture or large items left for days, not a mobility device used in passing. Nonetheless, she hammered the point in board discussions, demanding stricter enforcement. George Liu tried to mediate, reminding Janet that the wheelchair belonged to a resident with mobility needs and that the hallway was never fully blocked. "We must be flexible," he insisted. "We can't treat a mobility aid like random clutter." A few board members sided with George, but Janet remained defiant. Behind her professional facade, Janet felt a swirl of resentment. Why does everyone coddle this new occupant? She raged inwardly. She devoted time to preserving the complex's aesthetic. Now this wheelchair was an eyesore in her mind, a symbol of everything unruly that might slip through the cracks if the HOA got lax. Though she rarely took direct action beyond warnings, a darker thought began forming. If the board won't solve it, maybe I will. She told herself it was about principle. But beneath that veneer lay something closer to bias, a discomfort with disability and a fierce desire for complete uniformity. With each day, the tension mounted, driving Janet toward a drastic step she'd never publicly admit to considering. A couple of weeks passed with no major incidents, leading Diana to assume that maybe the tension was subsiding. She went about her daily routine, work, errands, a bit of socializing with new friends in the building. Despite Janet's scowls, Diana tried not to dwell on negativity. Then, late one Thursday night, she had an unnerving experience. She'd been out with a friend for dinner, returning home around 10:30 p.m. The hallways were dimly lit. As she wheeled along the corridor near her unit, the overhead fluorescent lights flickered slightly, a common building quirk she'd learned. Pausing at her door, she reached down to her bag to grab her keys. Suddenly, from behind, she heard a hiss of irritation. She turned her head to see Janet, again, emerging from the stairwell. Janet's face was flushed, eyes narrowed. It was unusual to see her about at this hour. "You again?" Janet snapped, voice echoing in the quiet hallway. Always stationed in the corridor. Diana stiffened. "Not this again." She strove for calm. "I'm just coming home. I live here. I'm opening my door, as you can see." Janet stepped forward, dangerously close to the wheelchair's handle. Diana's heart sped up. It doesn't matter, Janet growled. I'm fed up with you parking your seat here. This is not your private garage. Alarmed by her aggressive tone, Diana tried to keep her voice steady. Look, I can't vanish instantly. I need a moment to unlock the door. If you need to pass, there's space. She gestured to the ample gap in the corridor. Janet's lips thinned. For a tense moment, she loomed over Diana, seemingly about to shout further. Then, with a curt movement, she stepped around and brushed past, nearly knocking into the wheelchair's right wheel. The movement jarred Diana slightly, forcing her to pivot the chair to avoid a collision. It was over in seconds, but it left Diana shaken. She caught a glimpse of Janet's face, teeth clenched, eyes reflecting a troubling mix of anger and something else. Fear? Disgust? Diana couldn't be sure. Without a word, Janet continued down the hall, letting herself into her own unit with a violent twist of the doorknob. Diana exhaled slowly, her chest tight. That was too close. She half expected Janet to yank the wheelchair or say something vile. The hostility was undeniable. After fumbling with her keys, Diana got inside, locking the door behind her. She sagged in her chair, mind racing. Did she need to file a formal complaint about harassment? Before bedtime, she typed a concise email to George Liu, describing what happened, the confrontation, Janet's near collision with the wheelchair, the harsh words. She didn't want to cause a stir, but safety was a concern. If Janet's anger escalated, it could be dangerous. The next morning, George replied with concern. He apologized on behalf of the HOA and urged Diana to keep him updated. He said he'd speak to Janet about the importance of respecting neighbors' needs. Reassured, Diana tried to focus on her job that day, though her nerves still buzzed. Unbeknownst to Diana, that confrontation had only fueled Janet's frustration. Janet brooded privately, insisting to herself that the wheelchair was a menace, the occupant defiant. She told a close ally on the board that the occupant in 3G has no respect for the rules, and that some measures might be required. Her ally recommended a formal hearing, but Janet had little patience for bureaucratic processes. She wanted immediate results. Though she did not yet know how, Janet was on the brink of crossing a line from petty harassment to something far more destructive. Each corridor encounter reminded her of how powerless she felt when the board overruled her complaints. She wanted that wheelchair gone from sight, by any means necessary. That weekend, the Maplewood complex planned a modest social gathering in the courtyard, a potluck brunch to help neighbors mingle. Diana, eager to build positive connections despite the tension, decided to attend. She prepared a fruit salad, balancing the container on her lap as she navigated the elevator down to the ground floor. Outside, the courtyard bustled with people setting up folding tables, cheerful conversation floating through the warm air. Diana spotted Margaret, the retired teacher from across the hall, Elena, the mother, and a few others she recognized. The vibe was welcoming. People greeted each other with small smiles, exchanging Tupperware of muffins and quiche. Potted flowers and a small fountain lent a pleasant backdrop. George Liu, the HOA president, waved Diana over. "Great to see you," he said. He introduced her to a cluster of neighbors she hadn't met. "This is Simone, who organizes volunteer events. And that's Carlos, who heads our gardening committee." Simone, who'd messaged Diana on the forum, reached out to squeeze Diana's hand. "I'm so sorry about the trouble you've been facing," she whispered. "Please know most of us here support you fully. If you ever need a witness or backup, let me know." Diana smiled, touched by her kindness. "Thank you. I appreciate it." She tried to keep her voice light, not wanting to overshadow the friendly event with drama, but the relief of having allies was palpable. For the next hour, they chatted about local restaurants, shared slices of homemade pies, and even discussed potential group outings. Elena's kids ran around, giggling. A gentle breeze kept the summer heat at bay. Diana momentarily forgot the undercurrent of conflict. Then, near the potluck's end, a hush fell as Karen, Harnell appeared at the courtyard entrance. She wore a crisp blouse, her gaze scanning the crowd. A few neighbors looked uneasy. Janet had a reputation for souring gatherings with petty rule reminders. She stepped forward, offering a tight-lipped smile to George. "Lovely event," she remarked coldly. George tried to be polite. "Glad you could make it, Janet. Care to try some fruit salad?" He gestured to the table. Janet simply shook her head, eyes drifting over to Diana's wheelchair. For a moment, it appeared she might approach and say something. But with many onlookers around, she refrained. Instead, she turned to Simone to discuss garden bed compliance. effectively ignoring Diana's presence. Diana exchanged a glance with Margaret, who shrugged in mild exasperation. Despite the slight tension, the potluck remained pleasant overall. People parted ways with kind farewells, some giving Diana supportive nods. She left feeling comforted by the sense that the community, by and large, did not share Janet's hostility. That afternoon, however, an unsettling moment occurred. As Diana returned to her condo, she found a small slip of paper on her doormat. It read, in faint pencil scrawl, "Your wheelchair does not belong in this hallway, ever. Next time, watch out." A chill ran down Diana's spine. This was no official notice. It lacked an HOA letterhead or signature. The words "watch out" felt threatening. She looked around, but the corridor was empty. Could Janet have written this? Or someone else who shared her view? Shaken, Diana texted Simone about the note. Simone insisted she tell George and offered to come by for moral support. Diana swallowed hard, anxiety gnawing at her. She typed a short message to George, attaching a picture of the note. She also forwarded it to Margaret. Both responded with alarm, urging Diana to remain vigilant. That night, the overhead lights in the corridor flickered ominously as Diana locked her door. She kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see a shadow at the far end. The building's once friendly hush felt eerie. The scrawled threat echoed in her mind. Next time, watch out. An intangible tension pressed in. Perhaps it was just intimidation, an attempt to scare her into compliance. But was someone truly willing to harm her property or her person? A small part of Diana's mind whispered that the note might only be the beginning. She tried to sleep, but visions of slashed tires or a vandalized wheelchair looped in her thoughts. Meanwhile, in her own unit, Janet stewed. She had not left the note. She preferred official channels or direct confrontation. Yet ironically, the note's sentiments aligned with her beliefs. If anything, reading about it, through HOA chatter, only confirmed her perspective that others also disapproved of the wheelchair. She felt emboldened, rationalizing that extreme measures might be the only way to enforce the corridor rules properly. Days passed in a strained lull. Diana tried to carry on as normal, going to work, returning in the evenings, occasionally chatting with supportive neighbors. The threatening note weighed on her mind, but she clung to the belief that it might be an idle threat. George assured her that the HOA would handle any official complaints and that no rule required her to vanish instantly upon entering the corridor. Janet, for her part, simmered in frustration. She saw that her attempts to scare Diana away from the hallway had failed. The occupant in 3G continued living life, unbowed. Board meetings offered little comfort. Most members sided with George's balanced approach. Some even criticized Janet for her excessive zeal. Late one afternoon, as a thunderstorm rolled overhead, Diana arrived home carrying a small package from an online order. The corridor lights flickered with each rumble of thunder, casting shifting shadows on the walls. She parked her wheelchair near her door, rummaging for her keys. The hamper of laundry balanced on her lap threatened to topple, so she moved carefully. Then, out of nowhere, footsteps thundered from behind. She turned to see Janet coming up the corridor, face stormy as the weather outside. Again, Janet spat, pointing at the wheelchair, always blocking the door area. Diana pressed her lips together, exasperated. "I'm not blocking anything. There's plenty of space, Ms. Harnell." Janet jabbed a finger in the air. "You're still ignoring the HOA guidelines. I've told you repeatedly. This corridor is not your personal extension. Tenants should respect the common space." Her voice echoed in the empty hallway. Lightning flashed through a nearby window, illuminating Janet's furious expression. Diana took a calming breath. She repeated, "I'm sorry, but I have permission for brief stops. I'm just opening my door to get in. If you have an issue, please speak to George or the board." She tried to keep her voice steady, though she felt her pulse racing. Janet's eyes flicked to the hamper on Diana's lap. "I see you're making the hall a laundry drop spot now, too." She sniffed. "This has gone too far." Rain drummed on the roof. Diana, refusing to escalate, turned back to her door, determined to end the conversation. "Have a good day, Ms. Harnell." She inserted her key, ignoring Janet's glare. Janet stood there a moment longer, chest heaving with anger. Then, with a sharp pivot, she stomped off, presumably heading to her own unit. The corridor fell silent, save for thunder and the hum of overhead lights. Diana exhaled shakily, entering her condo. She locked the door, heart pounding. Another intense confrontation. She wondered if she should have recorded the encounter. Little did she know, the confrontation had cracked something in Janet. The older woman returned to her unit, fuming. She felt humiliated, disregarded, overshadowed by George's soft approach and Diana's calm defiance. She poured herself a glass of water, hands trembling. If no one else will enforce the rules, I'll do it myself, she resolved. Her eyes drifted to a pair of scissors on the counter, a random household item that, in that moment, seemed to glimmer with possibility. Of course, most neighbors would never dream of physically harming someone's wheelchair. But Janet's frustration, mixed with her sense of righteous indignation, was reaching a dangerous fever pitch. She told herself she wasn't truly hurting anyone, just dealing with an inanimate object that had become a nuisance. She believed, in a twisted logic, that crippling the wheelchair might force Diana to store it elsewhere, away from the corridor. As the storm raged outside, Janet's mind churned, rationalizing an act she'd once never have considered. She only needed the right opportunity. No cameras in that corridor. Everyone's in their units during storms. She stared at the scissor blades, a chill running through her. It's not about violence, she thought. It's about restoring order. 2 nights later, the weather cleared, leaving whispering cedars under a cool, starry sky. Street lamps glowed along the manicured sidewalks, and most residents retired early after a busy workweek. Inside Maplewood Complex, hush prevailed in the corridors. The building's central air whirred softly, circulating a pleasant breeze. Diana had met a friend for dinner again, returning around 9 p.m. This time, she quickly unlocked her door, not wanting any confrontation. She rolled inside with minimal fuss, letting the door click shut. The hallway lay still and quiet behind her. At around 10 p.m., she realized she'd left a small bag of groceries in her car, milk and fruit that needed refrigeration. Sighing, she decided to retrieve it. She wheeled out again, though only briefly, to ride the elevator down, cross the parking lot, and come back. 15 minutes total, maybe. In that short window, Janet found her chance. She'd noticed Diana exit her condo again, presumably heading outside. Janet guessed the wheelchair might soon reappear in the corridor, even if just for a moment. If she leaves it alone, that's my opening. So Janet slipped out of her unit, scissors hidden inside a folded magazine. The corridor was empty, lights dimmed. She scanned for possible onlookers. None. A quick glance left, and right confirmed no one was about. Janet tiptoed toward Diana's door. No wheelchair. Maybe she took it with her. Her frustration swelled. She almost turned back, deflated. Then she noticed a small sign pinned to the door, "Be right back. Thank you," which Diana sometimes used to let visitors know she'd stepped out. Perhaps the occupant was anticipating returning soon. Janet hovered. What if the wheelchair is just inside? Or if she's about to appear? She flicked off the corridor's overhead lights, a panel of toggles she had easy access to as a board member, plunging the hallway into semi-darkness. That way, if the wheelchair did appear, no one would see her lurking. She waited, breath quickening. After a few tense minutes, the elevator dinged on a lower floor. Janet strained her ears. Yes, that must be her returning. She stepped back into the shadow of a recess in the wall. Footsteps were minimal. Presumably, Diana was rolling back upstairs. Then, to Janet's surprise, the elevator dinged on this floor. The doors slid open, revealing Diana in her wheelchair, a small grocery bag balanced on her lap. She wheeled out slowly, somewhat preoccupied with the groceries. She didn't notice the corridor light was off or sense Janet in the shadows. Diana paused by her door, rummaging for keys again. The wheelchair angled so she could access her purse pocket. Janet's pulse raced. This is it. She waited for a fleeting moment, watching. Is she about to go straight in? Or might she step away? Diana realized she'd grabbed the wrong key ring. Oh, darn, she muttered, turning her wheelchair to head back toward the elevator, presumably to get the correct key from her car or storage. She left the wheelchair in neutral as she rummaged through the grocery bag for a moment, likely verifying she had the right receipt. The hallway was so dim, she was fumbling around. In that brief confusion, Diana did the unthinkable from Janet's perspective. She stood up, taking a single unsteady step. Diana could stand for short moments with the help of a brace, though not walk normally. She propped the bag on a small side table next to the corridor, leaving the wheelchair behind for just a second as she rummaged for the correct key. She had a slight ability to stand under certain conditions, though the wheelchair was still crucial for actual movement. This was an unusual scenario, but it gave Janet exactly what she wanted. Janet sprang from the shadows, heart hammering. Diana was turned away, focusing on the side table, trying to free her pinned key ring from some tangle. Now's the chance. Swift as a serpent, Janet darted behind the wheelchair. She flipped open the scissors and, with trembling hands, began sawing at the wheelchair's backrest straps, thick nylon that provided crucial support. Slash, slash. The material was tough, but in her adrenaline-fueled haste, Janet cut through multiple layers, severing the straps. In the darkness, the ripping sound was muffled. She felt a surge of triumph mixed with terror. Just enough to make it unusable, she reasoned. Then maybe she'll keep it out of the hall. Diana turned, hearing a faint sound. Hello? Is someone there? She called softly, though the corridor's gloom revealed nothing. Her night vision was poor. Unsteady on her feet, she quickly grabbed the wheelchair's handle to steady herself. That was when she realized something fell off, the backrest sagging. Her eyes widened. What? But Janet was gone. Having bolted down the opposite end of the corridor toward the stairwell, scissors concealed again. Diana sank into the chair, confused. The backrest collapsed beneath her weight, offering no support. She nearly slid off. Alarmed, she felt around, discovering the sliced straps. Fear and shock crashed over her. Someone cut my wheelchair. She called out. Is anyone here? No answer. The corridor remained silent, the overhead lights still off. Trembling, she realized she was effectively stuck. Without that backrest, she couldn't sit safely. She rummaged for her phone, adrenaline making her hands shaky. She dialed Margaret's number, her neighbor. In minutes, Margaret arrived, flipping the corridor lights on. The sight was stark, the wheelchair's backrest straps flayed. Margaret helped Diana gently out of the chair, supporting her while leaning on the side table. The sabotage was unmistakable. Tears pricked at Diana's eyes. She gasped, why would someone do this? I was only gone for seconds. Margaret, pale with anger, shook her head. This is a crime. We must call the police. She dialed 911. The police arrived soon after, taking statements, photographing the wheelchair. Diana also texted George, who rushed over from his condo a few buildings down. He stood aghast at the malicious destruction of vital medical equipment. While no one mentioned Janet by name in that moment, a grim suspicion settled among them. This was no random vandal. The corridor was locked to outsiders, and only a determined person with motive would do such a thing. Diana filed a formal police report, furious and shaken. She found herself forced to rely on Margaret's help to navigate even the short distance into her unit, as the wheelchair no longer offered the support she needed. Outside, the stars shimmered coldly. In the Maplewood complex hallway, the flicker of police flashlights illuminated the ruined straps. A neighborly hush was replaced by an undercurrent of horror. Some lines, once crossed, could not be undone. Word of the sabotage spread like wildfire through whispering cedars. By morning, neighbors buzzed with shock. Someone slashed the backrest on Diana's wheelchair? Many found it hard to fathom such malicious intent. The Maplewood complex had always seemed peaceful, if occasionally strict. Now, an undercurrent of fear and anger roiled beneath the manicured lawns. Diana woke with stiff shoulders, still reeling from the event. She sat gingerly in her battered wheelchair, propping herself with pillows to compensate for the destroyed back straps. She needed to shop for a replacement or emergency repair, but it would take time. Meanwhile, she could barely move safely around her unit without assistance. George Lou phoned her that morning, voice somber. Diana, I can't express how sorry I am this happened. We'll cooperate fully with the police. The HOA board is appalled. We'll do everything in our power to find out who's responsible. Diana, voice trembling, replied, I have my suspicions, but no proof. I just can't believe it. She hesitated. Could it have been Janet? She's the only one who's actively harassed me. George sighed. Look, I know you two had conflicts, but the board can't accuse her without evidence. Still, we'll question her. We have to. Diana thanked him, feeling a confusing mix of anger, sorrow, and fear. She typed a brief message to friends in the building, explaining her wheelchair had been vandalized. Instantly, messages of support poured in. "This is awful. We stand with you. Let us know how we can help." A group spontaneously organized a fundraiser to help her buy a sturdier backrest. Another neighbor, Carlos, promised to help repair the damaged straps if possible. Meanwhile, Margaret knocked on Diana's door, offering homemade soup and moral support. "We'll find a solution," the older woman said gently. "This community won't stand for such cruelty." She offered to drive Diana to a medical supply store if needed, or help coordinate with a wheelchair service. Moved by the kindness, Diana accepted. Across the complex, Janet Karen Harnell paced her living room. She'd hardly slept. The reality of what she'd done sank in. She had never before engaged in direct vandalism. A flicker of guilt gnawed at her, but she squashed it, reminding herself she'd only done it to solve a problem. Yet fear also loomed. What if someone saw me? The police are investigating. She briefly considered confessing or showing remorse, but her pride roared back. They'd never understand, she reasoned. That wheelchair kept violating the rules. I had no choice. She told herself to maintain her innocence. The building's corridor had no cameras, so she felt safe from direct evidence. Late that afternoon, 2 police officers knocked on her door, along with George Liu. Janet answered calmly, feigning surprise at their questions. "A wheelchair? Goodness, that's horrible," she exclaimed, face carefully composed. "Of course, I had nothing to do with it. Do I look like someone who'd commit vandalism?" The officers asked if she'd noticed anything suspicious the previous night. She lied smoothly, claiming she'd been home asleep. George pressed gently. "Janet, you've openly criticized Diana's wheelchair usage. Are you sure you have no information?" She kept her composure. "I only insisted on upholding the guidelines. That doesn't mean I'd stoop to harming her property." The police, lacking direct evidence, couldn't do more than record her statement. After they left, George shook his head, disappointed. He doubted they'd glean the truth from her if she was indeed responsible. Despite suspicions swirling around Janet, the matter seemed to stall. The police recommended that the building install cameras or do more thorough checks. Though the police investigation moved slowly, the rest of Maplewood Complex moved quickly to help Diana. Seeing how crucial her wheelchair was for independence, neighbors pitched in funds to buy an upgraded backrest. They found a model with reinforced straps, memory foam padding, and a snap-on design that offered more ergonomic support. One neighbor, a tech-savvy individual named Ben, suggested adding a small anti-theft alarm that would sound if the straps were tampered with. The cost was higher, but the community insisted on covering it. Within days, they ordered the new parts. Meanwhile, Diana borrowed a spare wheelchair from a local disability resource center, though it was less comfortable. The outpouring of help left her tearful with gratitude. Each donation, big or small, felt like a stand against cruelty. Simone, who spearheaded the fundraiser, told Diana, "We want to show that one hateful act can't break our sense of community." During this time, Diana rarely saw Janet. The older woman kept her blinds closed, avoided community gatherings, and only ventured out for essential errands. Some neighbors whispered they'd confronted her verbally, but she'd brushed them off with indignation. Lacking proof, no official blame fell on her, but the rumor mill churned. Few believed the vandal was anyone else. In a small meeting convened by George, the HOA board discussed implementing corridor cameras, or at least a policy encouraging cameras near doorways. Janet opposed it fiercely, citing privacy concerns. Another board member retorted that privacy had already been violated when someone attacked a mobility device. The motion passed, so the building would soon have security cameras installed near each elevator bank and hallway intersection. This outraged Janet, who saw it as an incursion on her domain. Nonetheless, the neighborhood momentum was unstoppable. As the new wheelchair backrest arrived, half a dozen neighbors gathered in Diana's unit to install it. Ben carefully set up the alarm, linking it to a small sensor that would detect any cutting or tugging on the straps. He demonstrated how it beeped if tampered with. The beep might not stop a determined saboteur, but it would alert others quickly. At the unveiling, a small cheer went up. Diana tried the new support, finding it more comfortable than her old one. She beamed at the group. "I can't thank you enough. This means the world to me." A motherly neighbor patted her shoulder, saying, "We protect our own here, dear. That's how it should be." Though the sorrow of the vandalism lingered, An opposing sense of solidarity sprang forth. The community had rallied to ensure Diana wouldn't be forced to cower or limit her movement. If anything, the new Backrest marked a step up, a more advanced, supportive piece of equipment that ironically improved her daily comfort. Yet tension simmered behind the scenes. Janet observed the camaraderie with growing bitterness. She realized her sabotage had backfired, winning Diana's sympathy and leading to hallway cameras. Her attempt to rid the corridor of that eyesore ended up strengthening it. The knowledge ate at her, fueling a twisted resentment. Meanwhile, the official HOA stance was firm. Any future harassment or sabotage would bring severe consequences, possibly legal action. George posted a memo condemning the vandalism and reaffirming that brief hallway stops by mobility devices were allowed. The entire board, save for Janet, signed it. The final line read, "We stand united against any act that threatens the safety and dignity of our residents." Diana, reading the memo, felt tears welling. In that moment, she knew Maplewood Complex was truly her home, a place where the majority refused to bow to intimidation. The new security cameras would be installed soon, ensuring less chance of clandestine acts. Indeed, in trying to stamp out what she called a hallway nuisance, Janet had unwittingly galvanized the neighborhood to embrace accessibility more strongly than ever before. A week later, while the Maplewood Complex's maintenance crew worked to install security cameras, the atmosphere felt charged. Diana watched from her doorway as a technician set a small dome camera near the elevator. She felt relief mixed with a lingering sadness that it had come to this. Camera installations to deter sabotage. But at least she'd be safer. By now, her new, improved backrest was fully installed, the anti-tamper alarm tested. She still occasionally worried about what might happen if she and Janet crossed paths. That anxiety soon became reality. One morning, Diana rolled into the corridor, heading toward the elevator. The new backrest provided excellent support, and the hallway felt bright with overhead lights. She exhaled, confident in her updated wheelchair. Suddenly, Janet stepped out from around the corner. She froze upon seeing the advanced backrest, her expression darkening. For a heartbeat, the corridor was silent. Diana's pulse quickened, but she refused to shrink. "Good morning," she said softly, trying civility. She turned the wheelchair slightly, giving Janet ample room to pass. Janet's gaze flicked to the new backrest, then the camera overhead. She let out a derisive snort. "I see everyone decided to lavish you with an upgrade," she muttered. "You must be quite proud." Maintaining calm, Diana replied. "Proud that the community stands against vandalism, yes. And that neighbors care about accessibility." Janet clenched her jaw. "Funny how your cause has overshadowed actual rules. You think you're above them?" Diana's eyes flashed with hurt. Why won't she let it go? But she answered quietly, "I'm following the rules as clarified by the HOA. My wheelchair usage in the corridor is permitted for short durations. It's not harming anyone." Janet's lip curled. She took a half-step closer. "You have no proof who vandalized your chair. Don't look at me as if I'm the culprit." Her voice wavered slightly, perhaps from guilt or anger. Diana stared back, heart pounding. She had no direct evidence, but the suspicion was overwhelming. She took a shaky breath. "I never accused you by name, but if you do know anything, you should come forward." At that, Janet's composure cracked. She pointed a trembling finger. "Don't you lecture me about right and wrong. I've dedicated years to preserving this building's standards, while you flaunt your so-called special privilege." Her voice carried a manic edge. In the hush that followed, footsteps approached, the newly installed security camera just overhead. Margaret and Carlos rounded the corner, drawn by the raised voices. They saw the confrontation, alarm crossing their faces. Margaret quickly stepped beside Diana, while Carlos eyed Janet warily. Janet glanced at them, realized she was being watched, and forced her expression into a brittle mask. "This conversation is over," she snapped. With that, she spun around and marched away. Margaret put a hand on Diana's shoulder, whispering, "Are you all right?" Diana nodded, though tears pricked her eyes from the stress. She quietly thanked them for intervening. The new camera silently recorded the tail end of the altercation, though no vandalism occurred this time. Later that day, George Liu summoned Janet for a private discussion. Word had reached him about the confrontation. The official stance was that any further harassment or intimidation especially near the newly installed cameras, would result in formal censure, potentially even eviction if it qualified as threatening or disruptive behavior. Janet bristled, defending her right to express concerns, but George was unyielding. A line was crossed when that wheelchair was vandalized, he said firmly. We are done tolerating hostility. This final warning from the HOA rattled Janet. She recognized that one misstep could cost her board position or more. She grudgingly agreed to back off. Yet inside, she seethed. That occupant wins again. She refused to see her wrongdoing, framing herself as the victim of an over-permissive environment. Meanwhile, the board posted an update acknowledging that while the culprit remained unknown, any new evidence would be taken seriously. They reaffirmed the newly installed cameras and the occupants' right to short hallway stops. The message was clear. Sabotage had no place in Maplewood Complex. Diana, reading the update, felt a wave of relief. She hoped the final warning would curb any further aggression. The new wheelchair backrest, ironically purchased due to sabotage, offered more support than ever. In a bizarre twist, her daily comfort had increased because of the vile act. Nonetheless, an undercurrent of tension remained. Some suspected Janet might lash out again. Others believed she would lie low. Diana tried to move on, focusing on her new sense of normalcy. Each time she rolled into the corridor, the camera overhead offered reassurance. With the anti-tamper alarm and support of neighbors, she felt safer. A small victory had emerged from the heartbreak of sabotage, community solidarity overshadowing bigotry. Over the next few weeks, Maplewood Complex found a new equilibrium. The corridor cameras quietly operated, capturing daily comings and goings. With the glaring presence of security, petty altercations diminished. Even Janet retreated, seldom seen outside her unit except at times she thought no one else would be around. Diana adjusted to life with the upgraded backrest. It felt sturdier, offered better posture, and the padded design relieved strain on her shoulders. She found she could sit for longer periods without discomfort. The memory of the slashed straps still troubled her, but the tangible improvement warmed her spirit. In a way, it was a triumph over the hateful act that birthed it. Neighbors continued to rally around her. Simone organized a small accessibility awareness night, where an invited speaker from a local disability advocacy center talked about inclusive design. Held in the building's community room, it drew a solid crowd. People asked thoughtful questions about everything from ramp slopes to visual doorbells. Diana was touched that so many wanted to learn more about living with mobility challenges. During the Q&A, one older resident asked, "How can we help ensure no one else faces harassment like Diana did?" The speaker emphasized the importance of bystander intervention, neighbors stepping in if they witnessed intimidation. Applause filled the room. Diana felt tears prick her eyes at such open support. The final straw in the sabotage saga came when the building's elevator camera captured Janet late one evening, scowling at the lens. She pressed the elevator button repeatedly, muttering. Though she didn't vandalize anything, the footage exemplified her frustration. After that, she seemed to vanish from communal life entirely, no longer attending board meetings. She evidently realized the cameras had stripped her of any chance to continue covert actions. The police eventually closed the wheelchair sabotage case for lack of direct evidence or confessions. However, the HOA board unanimously agreed to keep the cameras installed permanently, referencing the positive deterrent effect. The sabotage itself remained an unsolved puzzle, but most residents quietly concluded Janet was responsible. Yet none pressed charges. The symbolic censure and watchful cameras were deemed sufficient. For her part, Diana embraced a sense of closure. While the vandal had never confessed or faced direct legal consequence, the entire community had effectively condemned the act. The sabotage ironically spurred a wave of empathy, pushing the Maplewood complex to become more inclusive than ever. The new wheelchair setup was living proof. Heavier straps, snug comfort, and a shrill alarm if meddled with. By mid-autumn, the trees of whispering cedars turned crimson and gold. The Maplewood complex hallways were adorned with tasteful harvest decorations. Diana freely wheeled in and out, greeting neighbors with a smile. No one batted an eye if she paused at her door for an extra moment. This is how it should be, she thought. No fear, no hostility. In an unexpected twist, the sabotage had catalyzed lasting improvements. The corridor cameras, a clarified policy that truly included mobility aids, and a newly energized sense of neighborly cooperation. Even though the cause was ugly, the outcome glowed with communal strength. And what of Janet? Some said she might sell her unit and leave, embarrassed or unable to adapt. Others heard she kept to herself, nursing resentment. The board offered no illusions. If she stepped out of line again, they'd respond decisively. Meanwhile, life in Maplewood Complex carried on, demonstrating that sometimes adversity can spark a powerful, compassionate response. Months later, a light snowfall dusted the Whispering Cedars property. Holiday lights twinkled on balconies, and wreaths appeared on numerous doors. The Maplewood complex stood quietly in the dusk, each window glowing warmly. Inside, the corridors remained wide, tidy, and now under unobtrusive camera surveillance. Diana sat in her wheelchair near the building's glass entrance, chatting with Margaret while waiting for a rideshare to take them to a local Christmas market. She wore a cozy scarf, her wheelchair sporting a cheerful bag with a snowflake design. The new backrest supported her comfortably, and the anti-theft sensor lay discreetly installed. She rarely thought about it anymore, except for routine checks. The sabotage felt distant, overshadowed by the goodwill that followed. Margaret rummaged in her purse. "I have the tickets for that craft fair. I can't wait to see your reaction to all the holiday stalls." She paused, smiling at Diana. "You're looking well, dear. Does the new backrest still help?" Diana nodded. "Incredibly so. It's more comfortable than my old setup ever was. In a strange way, that vandal did me a favor, though I'd never wish this on anyone." Margaret's face clouded. At least something good emerged from their cruelty. But I still wish we'd found conclusive proof. The idea that the culprit faced no real punishment bothers me. Diana shrugged gently. The final warning, the cameras, the new community spirit. Maybe that's punishment enough. Everyone suspects who it was. She can't show her face without feeling that suspicion. A tinge of sadness laced her voice. "I'd have preferred honest conversation over sabotage, but I guess some people can't handle differences." Just then, Simone appeared in the lobby, carrying a wrapped present. She beamed, spotting them. "Oh, you're both here. Diana, I have a small gift from the neighbors, just a token of holiday cheer." She handed over the box. Inside lay a custom cushion for the wheelchair, embroidered with small images of daisies, Diana's favorite flower, and the words "Stay strong." Touched, Diana thanked her, eyes misting with gratitude. A gentle hush fell as they stood together, the reflection of holiday lights dancing on the floor. Margaret patted Diana's arm. "Ready for the market?" They all ventured outside, the crisp air bracing but refreshing. A sense of unity enveloped them, neighbors banded by compassion, standing in defiance of cruelty. The rideshare car arrived, driver offering a friendly smile as he helped load the wheelchair. Diana turned to wave at Simone. "Thank you again. You've all made this place feel like home." Simone waved back. "That's what neighbors do." As the car pulled away from Maplewood Complex, the scene through the rear window was telling. A modest, well-kept building shining with holiday lights and the knowledge that, yes, adversity had come in the form of sabotage. But the community's response, unwavering support, pragmatic improvements, and a refusal to bow to intimidation, had triumphed. And so, in that quiet suburb, the slashed wheelchair backrest became a rallying point. Instead of fracturing the neighborhood, it inspired deeper empathy and better infrastructure. The occupant once harassed had gained an even stronger sense of belonging. The would-be tyrant had slunk into obscurity, overshadowed by the resilience of the many. No cameras or anti-tamper alarms could cure prejudice entirely, but they could deter its destructive manifestations. Ultimately, Diana's upgraded wheelchair served as a symbol of that triumph, reinforced, more comfortable than before, and guarded by communal watchfulness. Through the darkest of acts, a brighter sense of unity emerged, ensuring that in Maplewood Complex, everyone's path would remain open and safe, free from the shackles of fear.